David has worked in the UK as a barrister and a senior public servant in the court service, and is now working internationally as a rule of law consultant, including currently on a very interesting justice sector project for PAI in Armenia. So David, when you've finished your presentation, I'm sure you'll be happy to respond to questions. You can ask questions in the question box as we go along. But rather than me telling you about that, I'll hand over to my colleague Amanda, who can explain much better than I can how the software, the webinar software works. So once again, very warm welcome. I think we've got people from the Caribbean, from Asia, certainly from Europe. So quite a wide range of countries represented. So thank you all, and I will rejoin you towards the end to say thanks again and to wish you well. So I will hand over to you now, please, Amanda.
Thank you, Claire. So a warm welcome to everybody. I'm just going to go through some very quick admin notes. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see there is a questions box, a poll box, a chat box, and a handouts box. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to put your questions into the questions box, as we will be doing a short Q&A session after the webinar itself. There will be poll questions launched throughout the webinar as well, so we do ask that everybody participates with this. Please talk amongst yourselves within the chat box. Myself and my colleague Denise will be monitoring this, and if you do have any questions, we are happy to help and answer on those. Once the session ends, the handouts box will appear with information with the slides and some marketing information on the actual webinar and other workshops that we run. Just to let everybody know that we are recording the webinar and it will be made available at the end of the session as well. David, I shall hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, I hope you can hear me. My name is David Greensmith, and welcome to this webinar. We're going to be discussing the questions set out here on the slide. Are leadership and management skills as exercised by those who support the judiciary in rule of law institutions generic or sector specific? And as part of this, we'll also look at organisational leadership and management skills for the judiciary. Judges lead and manage in a judicial setting. How far should this extend into the organisational setting? To frame this question, and looking forward to the workshop, we'll also explore whether managerialism and reform conflict with judicial independence, and, if there is time, look at one source of potential tension between the judiciary and those who work to support them, namely performance indicators. You know that the rule of law is internationally recognised as a fundamental constitutional principle underpinning democratic governance and respect for human rights, and that judicial independence sits as a cornerstone of that principle. Having said that, those institutions that administer the law and support its administration require leadership and management at the best of times from those working in them. And that is increasingly so in times of austerity, retrenchment, reform, and change. The continuing fallout from the global banking crisis, austerity, the pandemic, and now the cost of living crisis have combined to deliver major financial cuts to legal services and to the resources available to judges and those who work to support them. Alongside other developments, including populism, small government as political theory, and the promotion of private sector methodology, this is continuing to drive reform and change, both of which need leadership and management skills to facilitate and deliver. But those skills still need to be exercised in the context of judicial independence. And therein lies the source of possible tension, which is the subject both of this webinar and of our workshop: managerialism versus independence. As we will see, some countries, some systems have started to look at responses which include judicial leadership and management models. But I would suggest for many involved in justice systems, there remain concerns that management, driven by the state and implemented by those who support the judiciary but are employed by that state, is simply a new way to challenge and curb judicial independence. At the very least, tensions are often perceived between what those supporting the judiciary are thought to be seeking to achieve and the fear of encroachment into judicial independence. In this webinar, we will discuss aspects of leadership and management, which will mean looking at the generic skills proposed by key authors. However, with a focus on the judiciary and those who work to support them, I will be suggesting that the context within which these institutions need to be led and managed requires these generic skills to be reframed to reflect judicial independence. We do have a lot of PowerPoints to get through today, but there will be time, as Claire said, to discuss key aspects of the theme at the end, and also hopefully at our future workshop. So to confirm the structure for the session, we'll be looking at these 5 areas: the nature and extent of judicial independence, management and leadership in rule of law institutions, judicial leadership models, partnership working models, and performance and quality indicators. Let's start by looking at the 2 sides of the argument, judicial independence and managerialism, and as a good lawyer, I will take judicial independence first. With thanks to Professor Drury, who leads a workshop for PAI on this subject, the rule of law is generally considered to comprise, as you know, of these 3 elements. We will return to the wider concept of the rule of law when we look later at the idea of guiding norms, but for the moment my focus will be on the second of these bullet points, an independent, competent and honest judiciary. But hopefully in our subsequent workshop we'll also be able to look at how the other 2 aspects can generate tensions with implications for judges and again for those who work to support them. Taking a UK perspective, this quote encapsulates the view from one specific, albeit old, jurisdiction. Judicial independence is taken at its simplest to mean that judges must be free to exercise their judicial powers without interference from litigants, the state, the media, powerful entities, powerful individuals, such as large companies. The corollary to this freedom is that it is vitally important that judges are seen to be both independent and impartial. To use another phrase which everyone will be familiar with from the UK jurisdiction, justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. Turning to the international perspective, we have the basic principles on the independence of the judiciary endorsed by the UN General Assembly 1985 and 1990. You will know that there are 20 principles grouped under 5 headings, independence of the judiciary being the first of those, but also freedom of expression and association, qualifications, selection and training, conditions of service and tenure, discipline, suspension and removal. And we may get a chance either today or at the workshop to go into some of the other areas beyond independence of the judiciary. Any of these might, at any given time, be a source of tension either with the state or with those institutions supporting the judiciary. But for the moment, I want to focus on the first of those, independence of the judiciary, and the first 7 principles which come under that heading. Let's briefly consider each of these through the lens of today's question. Guaranteed by the state and enshrined in the law of the country, it is the duty of all governmental and other institutions to respect and observe the independence of the judiciary. Core principle. Cases decided impartially on the basis of facts and in accordance with the law, without any restrictions, improper influences, inducements, pressures, threats. Again, straightforward. The judiciary shall have jurisdiction over all issues of a judicial nature. That includes exclusive authority to decide whether an issue submitted for its decision is within its competence. No inappropriate or unwarranted interference with the judicial process, nor shall judicial decisions by the courts be subject to revision. That's without a prejudice to judicial review or commutation, mitigation. Everyone shall have the right to be tried by ordinary courts or tribunals using established legal procedures. Proceedings shall be conducted fairly, the rights of each party respected, and there is a duty of each state to provide adequate resources. Already, looking at these 7 principles, it's possible to see a number of areas of potential tension, and you may have experience of this and your own examples to reflect on. My examples come from the UK and are perhaps not the most egregious when viewed from an international perspective, but I am talking about the country that views itself as having devised the rule of law back in 1215. In terms of Principle 1, does encouraging the press, even to call judges the enemy of the people, as happened here during the Brexit controversy, respect and observe their independence? In the UK, the Lord Chancellor has a duty guaranteed by the state, as suggested here, to act in support of the rule of law and judicial independence. Nothing was said at the time or subsequently. The message was simply allowed to remain in the ether, unchallenged. And how does Principle 2 work when lay judges are advised by legal clerks employed by the state and dependent on that state for advancement, pay and pension, and whose performance is monitored by that state? I'm thinking here of the magistrate system seen in common law jurisdictions. And how does the wider relationship between the judiciary and their court service, established, funded and managed by the state, play out in terms of Principles 1 and 2? Moving on, how do Principles 3 and 5 interact with sentences effectively being passed by non-judicial panels, by the police or by prosecuting agencies? Fixed penalty notices, for example, being a very current topic here in the UK. In terms of Principle 4, the UK government has expressed an intention to curb judicial review, and I have had personal experience of a law being changed by Parliament here to directly undercut the implications of a legal decision on which I advised. Was that inappropriate? And is the concept of adequate remedies being undermined? And finally, looking at Principles 6 and 7, with cuts in resources, can hearings be conducted fairly in the absence of lawyers or legal aid? And what do court closures say about the duty to provide adequate resources? At this point, let me pause and make some preliminary observations. I would suggest that judicial independence should apply consistently across different jurisdictions, countries, and cultures within the common framework of the UN principles. But commonalities of interpretation also suggest some common tensions. Many national, international human rights and law reform organizations work hard to promote judicial independence, and all the UN principles assert that judicial independence should be seen positively by governments as an essential adjunct to good governance. And unless you correct me, it's difficult to find a respected author who speaks openly against the rule of law or against judicial independence. However, independence can also be seen negatively by governments, viewed as existing to protect judges from the intervention of representatives of the executive, the legislative, or economic powers, or, to borrow a phrase, from the representatives of the people. Nationally, the dangers come from parliaments and governments, sometimes quicker to proclaim the independence of the judiciary than to ensure its effective protection. Internationally, the dangers come from member states, parties to litigation, or the international organization itself. Sometimes it is suggested more concerned with their own interests than with the effectiveness of the international jurisdiction. But at both levels, there is an impact on those who are employed to support the judicial system in question. At a time when economic pressures and political populism are driving cultural and structural change across the public sector, why should the judiciary be exempt when those who support it are not? Which of course leads to the possibility for tension between the judiciary and the state, and between the judiciary and those who are employed by the state to support them. I've indulged myself there with some local examples. You may have similar or worse examples from your own experience and jurisdictions. So the first of the two polls that we're running today is just simply to reflect on events in your jurisdiction, wherever that may be. Amanda, could you launch the first poll, please?
I can indeed. So the first poll question is, are you aware of examples of tension in your jurisdiction between judges and the government, state agency supporting the judiciary? I can see that we are having some votes coming at the moment. And I will literally now just start the second poll question, which is, do you see managerialism as a potential threat to judicial independence? I'll let a few more seconds go by for this. Okay, so for the first poll question, we are currently at 86% saying yes and 14% saying no. And for the second poll question, we are, it's slightly changing now. We've got 48% that says yes and 52% say no. The polls will remain open, and towards the end of the session, we will also go back and see if any of the results have changed. So, David, I shall hand this back over to you.
Thank you. Those are interesting results. The first one overwhelmingly a yes, and it would be interesting at some point, perhaps during the workshop, to drill down into those figures and see if they reflect different jurisdictions across the world. And the second one is interesting, and again, it's a more balanced view. And again, it would be interesting to drill down to see exactly what people think and what's happening in terms of the jurisdictions, how affected people are by change, how affected people are by reform, and how it's being managed. Hopefully that suggests it's being managed well and is being managed in a way that protects judicial independence. So hopefully that second poll result is positive. But both of them we could drill down into substantially, and it would be interesting to follow those through. So maybe we'll have time for that at some other point in, for example, the workshop. Let me turn now, though, to the other side of the coin, which is what is expected of those managing or leading in rule of law institutions supporting the judiciary. How are they expected to manage or lead when increasingly the state looks to business-focused models as the way forward? And how can they deliver this evolving model while still managing their relationship with the judiciary and not impinging on judicial independence? And the poll results suggest that it seems that many people are satisfied with the way in which that's going forward. That's good. That's positive. What does it tell us also about the need for management and leadership within the judiciary itself in order to respond to that change? And perhaps changes have already been made. Let me start briefly by looking at theories of management and leadership. So many theories, whole careers have been based on this. So I have to be judicious in my choice of reference points. Thankfully, Peter Drucker's 1954 book, The Practice of Management, retains a unique position in terms of business management theory. And in this, he describes the primary goal of a manager as to make people productive. And in order to do that, he sets out these 5 key tasks, which are on the slide. You can see how these tasks would read across from the private sector, which he wrote for, to the public sector, and how they are necessary attributes for rule of law institutions and for their employees. My question, though, is how far the expectation on managers to deliver against these key tasks impacts on judicial independence. An interesting, earlier and alternative take on this was provided by Henry Fayol, who also identified what he thought were the 5 main functions of management. His terms are stark but useful. Command and control, for example, difficult to achieve when your organization plays a supporting role to others whose decisions you cannot control. Moving forward in time, but staying with the UK Chartered Management Institute publishes its own professional standards for managers, which, as you can see, are broken down into personal effectiveness, interpersonal excellence, and organisational performance. Not much has changed over the years. These again come from a private sector perspective and can be read back into Drucker's 5 key tasks on the previous slides. And the terms continue to highlight how managers and rule of law institutions might brush up against judicial independence when simply trying to maintain their professional standards. How do you lead change, innovate, or manage reducing resources, but maintain the delivery of justice? What scope is there for achieving results through setting goals and objectives, or for providing purpose and direction when your employees work in court or advise judges who make their own independent decisions that can affect your employees, your institution, and the public's perception of both? Who decides the roles and tasks for judicial support staff and managers? Who selects and develops them? Who trains them? How do you build relationships or network with other criminal or civil justice agencies, or seek to align priorities or achieve results when you are not the judicial decision maker? And who should communicate with these other agencies? And how do you influence them and also influence the judicial decision maker? These are day-to-day issues for managers in rule of law institutions, which is why I suggest that they need to make their skills sector specific, rather than relying on these generic management skills and theories. That was a very quick look at management theory. Let me turn briefly to leadership theory as well. Again, so many theories to draw on. So many theories, so many quotes. I've just put a few up there to give you a feel of the differentiation between leadership and management. People often mistakenly equate leadership with management. They are rarely wholly discrete, but there are some fundamental differences with separate and distinct skill sets. And hopefully these quotes start to pull those out. And there are more quotes. In research back in 1991, Joseph Rost found more than 200 different definitions of leadership. Imagine how many there are now in 2022. Behind these definitions lie different theories: trait, situational, path goal, transformational, amongst others. There are many theories of leadership. The key to differentiation, however, is to think about what the leader and manager each bring to the organization. What is expected of them in that role? For ease, I'm going to go back to Peter Drucker's work again. By the end of his life, even Peter Drucker acknowledged that leadership was important, and a student of his extracted the following leadership lessons from his works. If the key role of a manager, in his terms, was to make people productive, then Drucker believed that a leader was someone who had followers, and that leader's job was to create the desired future for the business. And I think you can see that from the quotes that were put up earlier. Leadership, they were suggesting, is an active, forward-thinking, influencing, shaping role. The leader needs to be intimately involved with forming the vision, the strategic direction, scanning the horizon, planning the future, and inspiring others to make it happen. That is a different role to managing. Drucker also recognized that the character and ethical behavior of leaders are of central importance if they are seeking to influence and to lead. According to Drucker, followers might forgive leaders for mistakes, but will not forgive a lack of integrity. Being of his time, he had great respect for how the military developed leadership, with an emphasis on character, leaders as positive role models, on commitment, and on taking care of your people. But he also admired non-profit organizations, suggesting that if a leader treated employees as if they were volunteers, free to leave at any time, then they would pay greater attention to the employees' non-monetary needs and move from transactional to transformational motivation. Finally, he suggested that leaders should be focused on the customer and be concerned about how customers view the organization and its products or services, setting the tone for how the organization is viewed and being its best representative. We can reflect on these observations shortly in terms of judicial leadership. Remember, of course, that for many people, it is the judge who is the representative of the rule of law institution, not the civil servant. So, to recap where we are in terms of my argument. Judicial independence is a sine qua non for judicial systems. Managers in rule of law institutions supporting the judiciary are being pressed to improve their management and leadership skill sets to meet the challenges of austerity, digitalization, and change. I call that managerialism. The drive for improvement is based on developments and approaches taken in the private sector, rather than specifically being related to the public sector or indeed to rule of law institutions. And this drive can create tension between managerial and judicial independence at organizational and individual levels. How, therefore, does one square the circle when managerialism meets judicial independence? Are there responses that assist both the judiciary and those who support them? And from the poll earlier, it would be suggested that there are these responses, and I'm going to hopefully identify a couple of those responses as we run through that we can pray in aid. So we're now going to turn to look at judicial leadership models and partnership working, because my suggestion, and this may be borne out by your experience, or the experience of 52%, is that these responses lie around judicial leadership, partnership working, and also recognition of sector-specific skills framed by judicial independence. Let me start this part with ideas around judicial leadership and around partnership working. Does judicial independence exclude the need for the judiciary to take a leadership or management role within the judicial institution itself, or within the administrative support institution? And in asking that, I make no distinction between those judicial systems where judges manage staff and those, such as here in the UK, where there is little or no direct line management of staff. Hunter and Rackley, in their work on the UK Supreme Court, identified 4 dimensions of judicial leadership. Administrative, this encompasses judicial governance, the running of the judiciary as a whole, or leadership within a specific court or jurisdiction, managing and negotiating relationships with other branches of government, the court service, judicial college, etc. Jurisprudential, this is thought leadership, the influence of a given judge on the decision or jurisprudence of a court in a specific area or more generally. Social, this focuses on the collegial and emotional needs of the court in its widest sense, keeping the court socially cohesive despite the inevitable conflicts that will arise when important issues are at stake. And community leadership refers to the various ways in which judges engage in outreach work to different communities, including the general public, the legal profession, academia, and international judiciaries. Extrajudicial work, or as described as Richard Corns in his work on judicial leadership, judicial statespersonship. I would suggest, hopefully you will agree with me, that these are recognisable dimensions in many jurisdictions beyond simply the UK Supreme Court. However, I think that we have to add another dimension that will be familiar to many judges outside the UK, which is the one that we don't have here, which is direct management and leadership of administrative staff. You know that in many jurisdictions, court presidents or other judges take line management responsibility for staff based in their courts. Unlike the other dimensions, this requires a direct exercise of the leadership and management skills expected of an administrative manager, and the judge manager must obviously be aware of distinguishing when they are exercising judicial independence or another dimension of judicial leadership, and when they are acting in a managerial capacity with staff. Staying with the UK, however, Sir Ernest Ryder and Stephen Hardy, in their recent book Judicial Leadership: A New Strategic Approach, focus on the UK model of leadership judges, which was a response to change brought on in the UK by the constitutional settlement of the early part of this century, and reflects to a large degree the administrative leadership dimension referred to here by Hunter and Rackley. They link this development directly to transformation and to the need for the judiciary to develop responses to the changes that the UK system have seen. No longer can the senior judiciary leave the administration of justice to others, It is central to their statutory functions, and it involves a constitutional partnership with the executive and a practical collaboration between all three limbs of the state. Note that in this quote, they are not suggesting direct involvement in line management. Constitutional partnership is the key to the UK model, and it may be the key to models that you're familiar with in your jurisdictions. But they do identify change as the driver for improving judicial leadership. Ryder and Hardy also look at the behaviours, responsibilities, and guiding norms that they see as relevant to this judicial leadership model. And you will see some links here between these behaviours and responsibilities and the leadership and management theories and definitions I spoke of earlier: motivation, accountability, team working, communication, alongside new ideas that reflect what Ryder and Hardy call, rightly, the unique position of the judge, for example, autonomy, self-protection. But all of these behaviours and responsibilities are placed within the rule of law framework, making them sector specific and providing, through their concept of guiding norms, a framework which Ryder and Hardy suggest mark out the leadership of the judiciary from other professions. And these ideas have been taken forward now in the UK by the Judicial College as part of their Judicial Skills and Abilities framework and the relatively new Judicial Leadership Training module. I would argue, however, these traits can also inform the exercise of leadership and management roles and discretion by those who support the judiciary, and that their roles can also be reframed using these guiding norms to reflect the impact of judicial independence. Constitutional norms, the rule of law, including judicial independence, and ethical standards. If, as suggested by Ryder and Hardy, the judge's role puts them in a unique position, which I think we would all agree with, then so too, surely, does the role of those supporting the judiciary. They have to carry out that work in a unique situation, unlike other civil servants. Before moving on to explore the second judicial or even joint response to managerialism, let me go back to the dimensions of judicial leadership again. Three of these, I would suggest, can be delivered without great concern about impacting judicial independence: jurisprudential, social, and community leadership, which can largely be viewed as internal to the judiciary or to the wider legal community. I would argue, though, that each can also be viewed as a judicial response to change and reform, ensuring judicial leadership and cohesion at a time of change and potentially encroaching managerialism. The two other dimensions, however, point us towards other responses: administrative leadership and direct management. Administrative leadership, where the judiciary need to explore partnership working with the administration or with other justice sector institutions, or taking a leadership role in the organisation of their own judicial administration. And direct management, where the judiciary need to reflect those modern management approaches in their own line management role, or to consider whether retaining such a role is actually appropriate. One popular approach, and you may be familiar with this, has been the creation of Supreme or High Judicial Councils to provide national leadership for judges and judicial systems. That's a form of partnership working that will sometimes include direct management and leadership of administrative staff. Another approach taken in the UK, as mentioned by Ryder and Hardy, through the conscious inclusion of references to judicial independence in the framework agreement setting up the UK Courts Service. This is the essence of the separate approach, or the different approach, which Ryder and Hardy major in. They suggest that to promote partnership working, the framework document identified roles in relation to the judiciary for ministers, the court service, and staff within the ministry and within the service to enable the judiciary to exercise their judicial functions independently. Key to this partnership idea are the ideas set out on the slide. Partnership, the first bullet point, relates to the effective governance, financing and operation of the court service. The responsibilities on the minister are to ensure that there is an efficient and effective system to support the business of the courts and tribunals, to resource that adequately, and crucially as well, to ensure that the judiciary is supported in undertaking its function to deliver justice independently. The responsibilities on the President of the courts include judicial deployment, the provision of welfare, training, guidance to the judiciary, and representing the views of the judiciary to the Lord Chancellor and ministers. The non-intervention statement is quite simple. The Lord Chancellor and Lord Chief Justice will not intervene directly or indirectly in the day-to-day operations of the agency. However, the judiciary are represented on the board overseeing the leadership and direction of the court service. That's partnership working, with an independent chief executive responsible for day-to-day operations and administration. And the statement of purpose includes the phrase, "The agency provides the support necessary to enable the judiciary, tribunal members and magistracy to exercise their judicial functions independently." There will be other partnership working models that you will be aware of, and in the workshop we can explore these options to see whether we can identify best practice that would work across different jurisdictions. One tension that the UK framework does not, of course, address is that of the judge having line management responsibility for administrative staff, and that is something that other jurisdictions do need to consider. What this model and the High Judicial Supreme Judicial Council model both have in common, however, is that they reflect an attempt to develop partnership working between the administration and the judiciary to ensure that judicial independence is maintained and that managerialism, management leadership, does not encroach on that independence. I would also suggest that these partnership models provide opportunities for administrative managers to reflect in their work on this sector-specific context, and the guiding norms, which were set out earlier by Ryder and Hardy, can be reflected to frame their work and their behaviours and their responsibilities. So, to recap again, we've looked at judicial independence and management and leadership theories, whether these generate tension between the institution or the staff and the judiciary. And we've looked at possible models which exist out there for resolving that tension, judicial leadership, partnership working, to ensure that judicial independence is the context for managerial decision-making in this sector. In the workshop, we can explore those ideas in much greater detail. But for today, I want to move on and move to the close by exploring one area of possible tension, namely performance and quality indicators. Let me start by saying that I believe that discussion of these indicators invariably demonstrates that whatever judicial leadership model one creates, and however skilled in modern management and leadership one is, there are areas which always run the risk of people thinking that they impinge or are set up to impinge on judicial independence. But then I'm also going to say that there's nothing to be afraid of in this, and that the judiciary and the staff who support them can use the approaches we've discussed to ensure that everyone can move forward together without that fear of judicial independence becoming a reality. Approached properly, performance and quality indicators can benefit everyone involved, as well as the general public and others involved in the court systems. We've mentioned earlier the potential issues connected with resource-driven change, including pressure on numbers, pay, courthouses, support, etc. In this context, the idea of measuring court or judicial performance can arouse suspicions of interference with judicial independence, and in some cases a reluctance to become involved in such measurement. One argument often advanced is that the only performance that is of interest to the judiciary is the performance of the court in the individual case. Has the case been dealt with fairly and according to law? Making the existence of routes to appeal and review judicial decisions, adequate remedies, as you know them, the only performance and quality control mechanisms required. And the creation of high or supreme judicial councils to oversee the judiciary is often seen as an adjunct to this provision of adequate remedies. However, a focus on the case and on the lawfulness or otherwise of the decision does not address those other issues which we know affect the public sector at large and are having to be managed and delivered by those who support the judiciary: efficiency, effectiveness, quality, and the pressure to do more with less. At all times, and particularly the time of reduced resourcing, performance and quality measures are two key performance tasks that must be delivered by managers and leaders. Quantitative measures drive the performance of organisations and of employees. And given that judges are employees within the public sector, should rule of law institutions not measure the efficiency, effectiveness, and quality of judicial work? The concern, rightly, is that numbers should not drive the pursuit of justice. How do we therefore balance the need for judges to respond to the increasing demands of public resourcing, while also maintaining independence in the individual case? Are there perhaps common or joint metrics between the judiciary and those who support them, and common or joint methods of scrutinising those? If we do accept that there is a need to look at efficiency, effectiveness, and quality in the judicial system, do we measure the performance of the system as a whole? And do we measure the performance of a local court? Or do we measure the performance of the supporting court's administration? Can you, should you, measure the performance of the individual judge? Can the office of judge be detached from all the constraints presently on the public sector, being as close as they are to the heart of the state? Is the principle of independence perhaps viewed too defensively? Should it be simply seen as one side of a coin, the other side being responsibility and accountability? You'll all be familiar with the concept of dashboards, which allow quick viewing of multiple key performance indicators. They set the pace for organisations, and individuals are held accountable to them through the organisational performance management scheme. I would suggest that you can develop these for judicial systems and for the judiciary, and we might have a go at that when we have time in the workshop with examples that you have from your own jurisdictions. And you may have examples which are good, you may have examples which are bad. Let me look at one simple indicator from our criminal jurisdiction. Average days from first listing to completion. You may have something similar. While measuring this seems an obvious guide to good performance, I can think of a number of external factors that might contribute to the outcome. There may be others. And the quality of case preparation, the quality of case management, the interim decisions ensuring that justice is seen to be done, the complexity of the case, the number and availability of judges, lawyers, witnesses, parties, but also the number and availability of courthouses, staff, and courtrooms. Dare I say the quality of the judges and the lawyers, or the availability of legal aid. The number of support staff available to record and process decisions, their speed, their ability, their training, and indeed the quality and availability of their technology. All suggesting that despite what it may initially look like, this is not solely a measure of judicial performance, nor solely a measurement of administrative performance. It's a metric that cries out for partnership scrutiny to get beneath the headline and see what the key determinants are for the part of the organisation that's being looked at, that's being measured. And there are interlinking judicial and administrative factors such as these in many seemingly good and simple performance indicators. And clearly the presence of factors relating to the individual case and to judicial decision-making suggests that those setting such indicators should bear in mind the potential of impact on judicial independence. They also suggest to me that the judiciary should not be afraid to get into that debate, and that joint leadership and performance scrutiny groups have their place in this work. Going back briefly to this slide, not all performance indicators are created equal. While some aspects of performance will be nice to have, others will be critical success factors for the rule of law institution. A useful definition is shown on the slide, those product features that are particularly valued by a group of customers and therefore where the organisation must excel to outperform the competition. It's useful, it's private sector based, but it makes the organisation look towards its customers and recognise that their opinion of excellence is more important and reliable than internally generated opinions. And that, I think, we can also take into the public sector and into rule of law institutions. I appreciate the choice of term, customers, clients, users, citizens, could be an entire webinar in itself in rule of law institutions, but there must be value in identifying what those who experience the judicial system think about it and where they think the system should strive to excel. And that includes how the judiciary present the judicial process as each case progresses. And there is competition to taking cases through your judicial systems. I can think of privately funded ombudsman services, ADR provision, administrative tribunals, youth offender citizen panels, as they are here in the UK, commercial arbitration services, and dare I mention again, fixed penalty notices issued by the police, amongst others. Which does take us back, as I mentioned earlier, probably in another webinar, to one of those underpinning principles, namely the right to be tried by ordinary courts using established legal procedures. If there is competition and there is choice, then critical success factors do come to the fore as a specific type of performance indicator. And how do the judiciary influence those processes if they are not involved? If you do not take a leadership or partnership role jointly with the administration, ensuring that everything is done with an understanding of judicial independence. And if you then move down from performance indicators to look at the objectives that flow from them, the targets that an organisation sets to achieve, then without judicial involvement, how can we say those objectives chosen for the system, chosen for the employees, are appropriate? You will know the acronym SMART. When objectives are set, they should be accepted and agreed. They also need to be relevant. If there is the possibility that decisions in an individual case might be a factor in an objective set for an institution or for an employee, then the judiciary, I would suggest, should be involved in discussion on the legitimacy of that proposal and on the scrutiny of the data flowing from its introduction. Similarly, who is best placed to say what is relevant in the judicial system? Without partnership working or scrutiny, and without consideration by the administration of the dangers of objective setting impacting on individual cases, there is a risk that objectives might be seen as a cynical exercise of management power. Having gone through the concepts, what indicators and what range of indicators are you familiar with? We will have time to discuss those in the workshop. I have 2 examples here. We can explore them further later. The UK measures that I'm very familiar with, transforming summary justice. That includes the average days from first listing to completion. You'll be able to see immediately the potential for multiple factors, administrative and judicial, to impact on any of these given measures. And the pressure that achieving the right performance outcome against these might possibly bring to the busy court, the busy judge, with a full list of cases to get through, or to the listing department sitting with a backlog of pleas and a backlog of trials. Moving across the pond, this comes from US core tools in America, and they identify 6 core judicial branch goals. And underneath each of these are a series of indicators, including clearance rates, pending caseload, time to disposition, and age of pending cases. Both of these examples, therefore, being largely efficiency and timeliness measures. You may have something similar in your systems. There are certainly similar timeliness indicators in the international framework for court excellence, which again we can look at in the workshop. Interestingly, though, in court tools, there are also ratings by court users on the court's accessibility and its treatment of customers in terms of fairness, equality, and respect. There is also a mention of quality in terms of the workplace environment, and I'm not going to let that pass without a swift mention. Quality indicators represent a subset of performance indicators that look, as the name suggests, at the quality dimension set by or for the organisation. We talk about the quality of justice, but does actually anyone measure this? Some public sector organisations have already wrestled with the idea of quality, including healthcare organisations, where we can see similar tensions between the administrators and the independent medical decision makers. The bullet points here represent some of the indicators used by healthcare organisations to try and measure quality. I'm not going to go through them, but I am going to suggest that you could find comparators for all of these in your judicial system if you think widely enough, and that many of them would not cross the line of judicial independence, but would assist the judiciary and rule of law institutions in being able to present to the public, who do after all pay for our services, the quality of the service provided. Working with the Courts Inspectorate before it was shortly before it was abolished in the UK, we developed a framework, a Greensmith-Chivers model indeed, to explore this aspect of the quality of judicial work. And the IFCE global measures, which you'll be familiar with, also include court user satisfaction as one of their 11 measures, looking at the percentage of court users who believe that the court provides procedural justice, this in terms of accessibility, timeliness again, fairness, accuracy, and knowledgeable and courteous judicial services. Again, we can explore the quality concept further in the workshop. Enough from me. It's time for the second poll, and that's for you to think about performance indicators in your judicial systems. Amanda, could you launch the second poll, please?
I can indeed. So I'm going to launch the first poll now. Do you have performance indicators specifically for your judicial system? Okay. And I will launch the second poll. Where should performance be measured? Nationally, locally, or individually? I'll wait a few more seconds for a few more votes to come in. So for the first poll question, which was, do you have performance indicators specifically for your judicial system? We have currently 53% of people saying yes and 47% of people saying no. And for the second poll question, which was where should performance be measured, we have 44% of people saying nationally, 31% of people saying locally, and 25% of people saying individually.
Thank you, Amanda.
Okay.
That's, again, interesting figures. Interesting that there are up to 47% of the participants who haven't got performance indicators specifically for the judicial system. And perhaps in a workshop we can bring together people from both sides to share what there is or is not out there in terms of performance indicators, and to share good practice and develop something that can be moved across different jurisdictions. And in terms of measuring nationally, locally, or individually, 25% is a good percentage that would say that it should be measured individually. And there is a debate to be had there about what you can measure against, what you can measure for an individual judge, what you can measure for an individual court, what you can measure for an individual jurisdiction. So we need to drill down into that and see what people are talking about. Nationally, performance indicators, if they're measured nationally, useful, but how does the individual judge, how does the court use this? Locally, more useful. Individually, to the court, to the individual, very useful information, provided it's handled properly, managed properly. And we'll just touch on that briefly before we close. So, to close on performance management, let me just make these observations. Measuring the performance of courts links with a responsibility and with accountability. Judicial independence must be retained in terms of the decision and the judicial path that leads to that decision, subject to adequate remedies, and is not lost if the decision is considered as one factor in a performance indicator that gives the judge tools to properly manage his or her cases and time. And that's where performance indicators do come in. They give information to judges. Faced with the principle of independence, those who manage judicial administrations must ensure that this is reflected in any agreed indicators and that their behaviours and in the performance of their leadership and management roles, they reflect the guiding norms. They come in here. The introduction of performance indicators, their design, and agreement on their use and disclosure assumes, I think, judicial and administrative engagement, partnership, and scrutiny. The important bit is scrutiny at the end there. In terms of using the data, it should clearly be aggregated, yes, if used outside the immediate court or jurisdictional setting, so as not to turn it into a personalised tool that could be used to try and influence individual judges. But internally, it does provide, you have the opportunity to provide some very useful information. We're running close to time, so let me move to close the webinar with some final thoughts. The traditional judicial landscape has been under pressure to change for a long time. Decriminalisation, diversion may be irreversible. We may see more fixed penalty notices. Similarly, further reductions in resourcing can only be expected. You will know that the UK government has recently announced further intended cuts to the civil service, which, even if not targeted at the Ministry of Justice and the court service, they're already struggling with a backlog post-COVID and post the previous cuts and court closures. It's bound to have a knock-on effect. Judges now operate in a world of sophisticated information technology and artificial intelligence, where information is routinely disseminated and shared via social media. You are subject to the court of public opinion. Populist politicians communicating directly with the public and promising instant solutions to difficult problems may become increasingly impatient with having to bow before the judicial process. And we've seen that increasingly in some countries across Europe in recent years. The future of the rule of law and judicial independence must not be taken for granted. I read an interesting article recently about the rule of law in China, and that's something, perhaps a different concept we can discuss at the workshop. To quote Lord Bingham, former president of the UK Supreme Court in 2011, there are countries in the world where all judicial decisions find favour with the powers that be, but they're probably not places where any of us would wish to live. Judges and staff working in judicial systems and in those rule of law institutions which support or administer these systems must manage their changing work and relationships within the framework of judicial independence. This concept makes leadership and management within such systems unique within the public sector. While retaining judicial independence, judges undertake a range of leadership and management roles alongside their judicial role and should work in partnership with senior civil servants, with judicial colleges, judicial councils and secretariats to manage and scrutinise reform and change agendas, ensuring that at all times judicial independence is maintained and made more secure. These new models of working drive unique sector-specific leadership and management needs for the judiciary, but I would say also for those who support them. There are sources of tension, and we've identified some of those, but there is no reason to be concerned about them, provided there is this partnership, scrutiny, and focus on judicial independence. And perhaps the results in the first poll do show that. And perhaps the guiding norms referred to earlier can inform both sides of that partnership. And in working together, those who support the judiciary may find benefit in thinking through how to make the skills that the state now requires them to exercise sector-specific rather than generic. thinking about how to balance independence with efficiency. And that is the subject of the workshop which we will run later in the year. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking part. Amanda, Denise, to close, are there any questions that have been posted?
There are indeed, David. So the first question is from Brenda, and she is asking, one other source of tension from the change or reform agenda that you have not mentioned are integrity checks. How do you think the judiciary should respond?
Integrity checks can be a tension, and I'm aware of pushback against them in some jurisdictions. I'm also aware of jurisdictions which do not, at least in a public-facing way, have such checks, but still have inspection systems in place. I would say that checks undoubtedly have a role to play in ensuring the continuing development of an independent and respected judiciary, and that the judiciary should again here take the lead in embracing them, even if there's no history of corruption or of challenges to judicial integrity. Again, they could be an example of leadership and of partnership working. No one should be afraid of such checks, unless, of course, they've got something to hide.
Okay, and the second question is from Terence, and Terence is asking, should the judiciary report to Parliament, and if so, how, when, what reports, and by whom?
That's probably 4 questions in one, if not 5. There are reports presented by the court service in the UK to Parliament, and there are reports used to be presented in the old system when the Lord Chancellor was a senior lawyer. He or she could report directly to Parliament, either through the House of Commons or the House of Lords in the UK. Should the judiciary generally report to Parliament? I would say yes, there's nothing to be concerned about a report to Parliament as part of the third branch of the state, provided that the report is recognised and given in the sense that it is coming from a branch of the state rather than from a subordinate perspective. And that is the concern, that a Parliament that's receiving reports from a judicial institution might consider it to be the subordinate partner. And that's not the case. So you would have to look at who presents them, and the court service here is a good example of who should present them. What reports they should present. There should be annual reports which include performance indicators with explanations of what they're about. By whom? It should be by the minister responsible for the courts, not by the judiciary. To have the judiciary presenting their own reports potentially leads to that subordinate issue. It's a difficult one, that, and perhaps we can tease that out with examples at the workshop of who does what in which jurisdiction, and identify some good practice for partnership working between the different branches of the state.
Thank you, David. We've had another question come through from Brenda, and she's asking, what other possible areas of tension do you think those who support judges should be aware of?
Training is the most obvious area after performance indicators. Control of training gives control of direction and input, and can blur that line that I was just mentioning there between the executive and the judicial branches. Judges should train judges, is how it's portrayed. And again, I think here one should be looking at judicial leadership and partnership, alongside ensuring that the judiciary possess the necessary training skills to enable them to be good trainers. Being a good lawyer does not automatically mean that you're a good trainer. And I think in the workshop that we will be running, we could look at developing training skills for lawyers. Alongside training probably comes the everything else that's encapsulated in those 5 principles that I mentioned right at the beginning, from the UN principles There was independence of the judiciary, freedom of expression and association, qualifications, selection and training, conditions of service, tenure, and discipline, suspension and removal. Each of those probably has the potential to develop an area of tension between the judiciary and those who support them. And then I think you've got general tensions arising from changes in technology, in society, in legislative intent. And again, we can look to Eastern Europe in terms of the approach taken to balancing the executive, legislative and judicial branches, often there by the executive branch at the expense of the legislative or judicial branches. Again, hopefully, like training, we can spend some time on that at the workshop.
Okay, thank you, David. That was all of the questions that we have. Claire, you're there. Perfect.
Yes, well, thank you, David. Thank you very much. That was terrific, and really an awful lot there. I don't know quite how you managed to get through such a lot of interesting concepts and thoughts and theory and practice all in just over an hour. So thank you very much indeed. You've mentioned a couple of times that we're planning a workshop which will be led by you on leadership and management for judges, for the judiciary. And I think we may have one more slide, might we, to flag that up with the dates. Here we go. So we run a number of law and justice related workshops here in London and elsewhere. And the second one down that you can see, if you can see that slide, is the one that David will be leading. It's a new one that David's kindly been developing with us, but promises to be a much fuller a week's worth really on these very interesting and quite challenging topics. It's planned to be in London face to face, but if you can't travel for any reason and are interested in joining remotely, then please let us know. We'd be happy to have you do that as well. And indeed, we're also very happy to run tailor-made programs just for your organisation, either here in London or with you in your own countries. So I hope you've enjoyed the session today, and thank you so much again for joining. David, a big thank you to you once more, and also to Amanda and my colleague Amanda and my colleague Denise for running the show. And I hope to be in touch with you again soon. Do let us know if you want any further information. And Amanda, I think you'll be sending on the presentation slides, or having those available, as well as the recording. So if you want to refresh your memory about any of it, then you'll have that over the next few days. So just to wish you all well, thank you so much again for joining us, and we look forward to being in touch. Okay, bye-bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.